Somewhere around 325 AD, a group of men gathered in a room and made a decision. Not a political decision, not a military decision, a decision about what human beings were allowed to know. They decided which texts would survive and which would be destroyed, which version of history would be told and which would be buried, which understanding of the divine, of consciousness, of the nature of reality itself would be handed to the next 1,000 years of human civilization, and which would be erased so completely that most people today do not even know it existed. The meeting was called the Council of Nicaea, and what happened inside that room did not just reshape Christianity, it reset the entire trajectory of human consciousness. Today we go into what was decided, what was destroyed, what was hidden, and what the men in that room understood about the power of controlling what people are allowed to believe about themselves and the world they live in. This is the hidden knowledge they never put in the history books. Let's go deeper. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what existed before the men gathered in Nicaea. In the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, the spiritual landscape of the Mediterranean world was extraordinarily diverse. There was no single Christianity. There were dozens of Christian traditions, each with their own texts, their own understanding of the divine, their own practices for accessing direct spiritual experience. The Gnostic Christians believed that the divine spark existed within every human being, and that direct inner knowledge, gnosis, was the path to recognizing it. They had no need of priests or institutional hierarchies. Each person was their own access point to the divine. The Marcionites rejected the God of the Old Testament entirely, teaching that the true divine was something far more subtle and compassionate than the wrathful deity of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Ebionites understood Jesus as a human being who had achieved a state of divine consciousness, not a supernatural being, but a demonstration of what human consciousness was capable of becoming. And beyond Christianity, the wider world contained the full flowering of the ancient wisdom traditions, the Hermetic schools of Alexandria, the Neoplatonic philosophers, the mystery traditions of Egypt, of Greece, of Persia, all still alive, still transmitting, still producing human beings who had direct experiential access to states of consciousness that the institutional world would spend the next 17 centuries declaring impossible. This was the world that existed before the meeting, a world of genuine spiritual diversity, of competing understandings, of living traditions that gave individuals direct access to the divine without institutional permission. And it was precisely this world that the Council of Nicaea was convened to end. Let's go deeper. The Council of Nicaea was convened in 325 AD by the Roman Emperor Constantine, not a religious figure, a political one, a man who had spent his career consolidating power across a fractured empire and who understood, with military precision, the relationship between unified belief and political control. Constantine did not convene the council because he was spiritually motivated. He convened it because a unified religion was a more effective tool of empire than a fragmented one. A population that agreed on what was divine, what was true, and what was permitted was a population that was far easier to govern than one that did not. The bishops who gathered at Nicaea had 3 tasks. The first was to establish the official nature of Christ, fully divine, fully human, co-equal with God. This decision was not unanimous. It was contentious. and the version that won was the one that required the greatest institutional intermediation. A fully divine Christ was a Christ that could only be accessed through the Church. A human Christ who had achieved divine consciousness was a Christ that anyone could potentially emulate directly. The second task was to begin the process of determining which texts were canonical, which writings would form the official scripture, and which would be excluded. This process continued for decades after Nicaea, but the Council established the framework. The texts that supported direct inner access to the divine, that described multiple paths to spiritual experience, that preserved the diversity of early Christian understanding, these were systematically excluded. The third task was the most consequential and the least discussed: the active suppression of competing traditions. In the decades following Nicaea, the Roman imperial apparatus, now allied with the institutional church, began the systematic destruction of the traditions that had existed before the meeting. Temples were demolished, libraries were burned, teachers were silenced. The Hermetic schools, the Neoplatonic academies, the Gnostic communities, all were dismantled with the efficiency of a military campaign. In 391 AD, the Great Library of Alexandria, the largest repository of ancient knowledge in the world, was destroyed. The full scope of what was lost in that destruction has never been calculated, and it was never meant to be. Let's go deeper. But not everything was destroyed. Some of it was hidden, preserved by individuals and small communities who understood what was being lost and risked everything to prevent its complete erasure. In 1945, an Egyptian farmer near the town of Nag Hammadi made one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in modern history. He unearthed a sealed clay jar containing 13 leather-bound codices, ancient books, filled with texts that had been hidden in the Egyptian desert sometime in the 4th century, almost certainly around the time of the post-Nicaean suppression. The Nag Hammadi Library, as it came to be known, contained over 50 texts that had been excluded from the canonical Bible: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Secret Book of John, texts that described a Christianity radically different from the one that survived the Council of Nicaea. A Christianity in which the divine was within, in which direct inner experience was the primary path, in which the institutional hierarchy was not a gateway to the divine, but an obstacle to it. These texts were not discovered by accident. They were hidden by people who knew they were preserving something that the official version of history intended to bury, and they survived. Meanwhile, the Hermetic texts, the foundational documents of one of the most sophisticated wisdom traditions the ancient world produced, survived through a different route. Preserved in Arabic translation through the Islamic scholarly tradition during the European Dark Ages, they re-entered Western consciousness during the Renaissance, when a Florentine scholar named Marsilio Ficino translated them at the request of Cosimo de' Medici. The knowledge that was buried at Nicaea did not disappear entirely. It went underground, it waited, and it kept resurfacing in the Sufi tradition, in the Kabbalistic tradition, in the alchemical tradition, in the Renaissance, in the Romantic movement, in every period of history when the institutional grip on human consciousness loosened enough for something deeper to come through. Let's go deeper. Here is what the Council of Nicaea was really about. Not theology, not the nature of Christ, not the canon of Scripture, control of the inner life. Because whoever controls what you believe about your own nature, whether you are divine or fallen, whether you have direct access to higher truth or require institutional mediation, whether the authority for your own inner experience lives within you or outside you, controls everything else. Constantine understood this. The bishops understood this. The Roman imperial apparatus that enforced the decisions of Nicaea understood this. A human being who believes they are a fallen creature, fundamentally separated from the divine, requiring priestly intermediation to access forgiveness and salvation, that human being is permanently dependent, permanently manageable, permanently in need of the institution. A human being who believes what the Gnostics believed, that the divine spark lives within them, that direct inner knowledge is available to anyone willing to do the inner work, that the authority for their own spiritual experience does not require external validation, that human being is sovereign, and sovereignty is the one thing that empires cannot tolerate. The decision made at Nicaea was not primarily spiritual, it was architectural, the architecture of a civilization in which human beings would relate to the divine through institutions rather than through direct experience, in which the inner life would be mediated, managed, and controlled by external authority, in which the most radical and liberating knowledge that the ancient world had produced, the knowledge that you are, at the deepest level, an expression of the divine itself, would be declared heresy. That architecture has governed Western civilization for 1700 years, and you are living inside it right now. Let's go deeper. So why does a meeting that happened 1700 years ago matter to you right now? Because you are still living in the world it created. Every assumption you carry about the relationship between the human and the divine, about whether direct spiritual experience is possible or delusional, about whether inner knowing is trustworthy or suspect, about whether you need external permission to access the deepest layers of your own consciousness, was shaped by the decisions made in that room in 325 AD, the belief that you are fundamentally separate from the divine, that you need an institution, an authority, an expert intermediary to access what the ancient traditions said was already within you, that the inner life is private, unprovable, and ultimately less real than the external world of measurable facts. These are not natural human assumptions. They are installed ones, installed by a civilization that was architected at Nicaea to produce exactly this relationship between human beings and the source of their own experience. And here is what the hidden knowledge recovers. Not a new religion, not a new institution, not a new set of beliefs to replace the old ones. Something simpler and more radical than any of those things. The recognition that what the ancient traditions pointed at, across Egypt, across Greece, across India, across every serious inner lineage that existed before the meeting in Nicaea, was not mythology, was not superstition, was a precise and sophisticated map of human consciousness and its deepest capacities, a map that was taken from you before you were born, and that has been waiting in hidden libraries and buried texts, and the persistent testimony of every mystic who survived the institutional suppression, for you to find your way back to it. That is what this channel exists to recover. In 325 AD, a group of men gathered in a room and decided what you were allowed to know about yourself. They decided that the divine was outside you, that direct inner experience was dangerous, that the authority for your own consciousness belonged to an institution rather than to you. And then they burned the libraries, silenced the teachers, and buried the texts that said otherwise, but they could not burn everything. The Gospel of Thomas survived in a clay jar in the Egyptian desert for 1600 years. The Hermetic texts survived in Arabic translation. The Neoplatonic philosophy survived in the margins of medieval manuscripts. The inner traditions survived in Sufi poetry, in Kabbalistic mysticism, in the alchemical tradition, in every lineage of direct experience that found a way to persist through 17 centuries of institutional suppression. The hidden knowledge was never destroyed, it was waiting. For a moment in history, when the institutional grip on human consciousness loosened enough for it to come back through. That moment is now, and this is where we find it. If this opened something, leave a comment below. Tell us what you think was really lost at Nicaea. We read every one. We will see you in the next one.